giorno. You're listening to Going, where God is at work, a podcast where cross-cultural workers discuss everything from faith and fear to finances and faux pas. We're walking out our call to ministry in faraway places and happy to have you join us on the journey. I'm your host, Jesse Pauly, missions leader serving in Rome, and I'm here with Alessandro Di Leonardo, church planner in Cisterna di Latina, and Jenn Williamson, our missiologist who lives and works in Lyon. Welcome back, guys. How are you?
Doing well.
Yeah.
I feel like it's been a while since we've been on because we had to do some batch recording and we were traveling and stuff. So I feel like I'm working out the kinks again and doing all the production side of stuff. Well, great. We are continuing. So we did a couple bonus sections, but we are continuing in working through parts of Jenn's dissertation today. And so we're going to be talking about which approach is best, the apostolic, the contextualization, or indigenization. I probably butchered that last pronunciation a little bit there, but we'll work through it as we talk this morning. So yeah, guys, just to start us off and to open up kind of the conversation, when you go somewhere, what's your approach? Do you study up on a place ahead of time? Do you look for someone local to kind of show you around, or do you just show up and explore? Like, what's your guys' approach to discovering a new place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I never know what you're doing until you compare yourself to others. Like I thought we were, because my wife is the one who plans things, and so I thought we were pretty organized and planned until I meet others who have everything scheduled. But just to kind of briefly answer that question, I would say from my perspective, I prefer it when we go to a place where we know somebody and who's a local, and they show us around. That's just the experience I enjoy. I'm not much of an explorer, and a lot of times I don't even want to go to a place if I don't know that I'm gonna meet somebody I know. And so that's just the personality and experiences I have. That I've always had a better time when I went to a place that I know. So, for example, I never had any desire to go to France, honestly, but now I would love to go because now I know you, Jenn.
hmm Well, that's true what you said, Alessandro. We just kind of do things our way until we hear how other people do them, and we realize, oh, there's lots of different approaches and different ways we could enter in. I was raised by a dad who loved to travel and was really adventurous. So, like, one of my favorite experiences in discovering a place is when I was a senior in high school. I traveled to China with my dad and my mom and one of my sisters. My dad had business trips to Asia all of the time. So he took us with him on this one. And we were at the Forbidden City, which has been in lots of movies and things like that. And we were just sort of dropped off at the front gate. And there were official tours where you could sign up. But then there was this guy who was just like, hey, I'll show you around for this much money. And just some guy, like no official title or anything. And we're like, my dad's like, sure, let's do it. And he took us through the whole Forbidden City and told us all sorts of stories. Now, honestly, I don't even know if any of them were true. They could have all been made up. Everything I know about the Forbidden City might be a lie because it came from this guy. But it was interesting and he was friendly and it seems like he knew what he was talking about. When we got to the very back, he said, I need you to pay me here because probably what he was doing was illegal. And my dad just paid him in the back. And then, he finished the tour and brought us all the way back through and everything. But I loved discovering it through his eyes. And like I said, was it historically accurate? Did he know what he was talking about? I don't even know. But I have a great memory of the Forbidden City and learning about it that way. So I love having a local tour guide, whatever that means.
Yeah. I'm trying to think because we're actually going to be going to Portugal for the first time and coming up actually at the end of this week. And we're going to go for a conference, but then we're also going to have some family time there. And we've never been. And historically in our marriage, we've always traveled and kind of once we got there, we started Googling and trying to figure out what to go see but this is one of the first times my wife's like, yeah, I'm going to look up and see like, what should we eat? What should we go visit while we're there? And And so she made like a to-do list of things that we share. I'm kind of stuck in the middle. Sometimes I would like to have someone show me around, but sometimes then you see things at a different pace and whatnot. So a lot of times I like going places and then later kind of looking up what did I see, kind of reflect back on, oh, that's what that was about, or that, because I feel like if I try and learn the history before I see it, then I don't, something either doesn't connect. Either I don't think I don't appreciate what I'm seeing, or I don't really fully get the history. But when they're removed and I have a chance to actually sit and think with it, I think I
Yeah.
appreciate it better.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And there's also different kinds of guides, I guess, too, because once, I'd been to the Louvre, I don't know, 5, 6 times when I had a friend visit who was an artist and who literally has an art degree and studied art.
Yes.
And when I went through the Louvre with her, it wasn't a French perspective per se, but it was an expert's perspective. And she helped me notice and understand a bunch of things about works of art that I'd seen many times before, but never noticed.
Yes.
So there's also like different kinds of help when we're touring different venues.
Yeah, I think that's the part. I think when there's someone who can kind of dumb it down to layman's terms for me, then I understand
Mhm.
and appreciate that so much more than someone who
Yeah.
can recite all the historical things, but then it still remains too high for me to grasp. No, that's great. And I think, this is a great transition into if there's different approaches to how we go and travel the world and see new places, um, then there's also different approaches to how we enter into a new country as a missionary or as a global worker. And um, yeah, Jen, why don't you share with us a little bit where we're going to go in the direction we're going to take this?
Yeah. So historically, you can kind of group how people have approached missions into 3 big buckets. And that's not to say that, any missionary who went out had like these 3 options before them and said, "Hey, I'm going to choose this." It's more saying as we look back historically on how people have done this, we can kind of see 3 main sort of different approaches that have emerged. And those, there could be lots of titles. What I'm going to call them are the Apostolic method, Indigenization, or Contextualization. So those who do what we'll call the Apostolic method, it's sort of this idea of a parachute. Like imagine a plane is flying over country and someone just sort of parachutes in. They're a total outsider. They don't have any connections to the place or to what it is, and they go in and they just start, sharing the gospel and and telling people about Christ, and they're sort of known as wandering evangelists. That's what Roland Allen would have called them in his one of his seminal works on foreign missions called Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours, and that was published way back in 1912, by the way.
Hmm.
But it's this idea that I'm going to go in, but I'm going to I'm going to train a local person, and then I'm going to leave. So I parachute in, I do some evangelization, I train someone, and I leave. Apostolic, in and out. So the strengths of that is from the very beginning, the missionary is already thinking they're not the long-term solution. They're already thinking this needs to be led by locals. Um, and and they also really have a great confidence in just the power of the gospel itself. Like the word of God is going to transcend any cultural difference, and God can do his work regardless of whether I speak the language or know the culture. It's going to be a spiritual work. And I think that's a cool thing to have faith in. So the gospel message is the priority there. I think maybe some of the weaknesses though could be is that, it requires outsider leadership from the onset. So it's the stranger who's leading the church, um and a lot of times those leaders struggle to truly hand over or to even plant something that is sustainable in the local culture, because sometimes, well, the missionary pastor is, for example, receives a salary from outside of the country and can dedicate full-time work to it, whereas local workers in the church, even if they fully believe and understand the gospel, they have to eat and they have to earn a living, and so they can't necessarily dedicate the same amount of time and effort to this. So it's not always sustainable within the culture. So swinging sort of to the other end of the spectrum is the idea of indigenization. And this is an approach that's really supported by K.P. Yohannan and some others. And this is the idea of, look, people who are in the culture have the best ability to reach their own people with the gospel, and they just need those outside resources. So why don't the countries that have the economic capacity and the resources just send those to locals and let the locals do all of the work from the beginning, and leave it to the natives? And so the strength is, it's much more economical. What it costs for a local person to live and do work in their own culture is usually way less expensive than a foreigner moving in to that place and sustaining sort of a level of lifestyle that they're used to. And it also, no need to learn language, no need to learn culture. So those things are already built in from the beginning. But the weakness there is that it eliminates what I like to call the necessary stranger. So people within a culture are often blind to their own cultural sins, and it sometimes takes an outsider voice to help people see where the gospel is so contrary to our native ways of thinking. And also, we know from the Bible that the kingdom of God is a multicultural kingdom. So having a monoculture expression of church would actually fail to reflect the multicultural kingdom of God, which is one of those really powerful, powerful things. So the third method, which is the one that I think most of us are nowadays trained in, and again, it's not, Hudson Taylor wasn't trained in this one, but this is what Hudson Taylor did. And this is who we're emulating when we do contextualization. So the word contextualization wasn't even coined until 1972. But it's a concept that's been widely accepted and applied in cross-cultural missions ever since. And so contextualization is really the attempt to present the gospel in a culturally relevant way. So it's Alan Hirsch says contextualization is primarily concerned with presenting Christianity in such a way that it meets people's deepest needs and penetrates their worldviews, thus allowing them to follow Christ and remain in their own cultures. So it stands in contrast really to the colonialism that permeated some of the early approaches, where we're going to get in, not only are we going to share the gospel, but we're going to make people in every culture dress like us and speak our language and those sorts of things. And contextualization says, no. The gospel can come alive and have impact within most cultures. Within all cultures. And there's going to be some things that the gospel will correct and say, wait, this cultural belief or understanding is wrong. This is not how God created the world. But there's other things within every culture that actually already do reflect the kingdom of God. And then there's a bunch of things in every culture that are sort of gospel neutral. And a lot of those have to do with, how do we cut our hair, or what style of music are we playing? So the strength of contextualization is it takes these cultural differences into account when sharing the gospel, and it helps us avoid imposing our cultural biases onto others, because actually all expressions of the gospel are contextual, are cultural. So if I think that my expression of the gospel is pure, but the French expression is somehow tainted by their culture, I'm very blind to the fact that my interpretation is tainted by my worldview and my cultural background and my upbringing as well. The weakness is though that some missiologists fear that contextualization can lead to syncretism. And syncretism is when we mix Christianity with assumptions that are incompatible, and so that the result isn't actually a biblical Christianity. So syncretism happens, we see examples of this where people, for instance, in the Hindu culture, might add Jesus as one of their gods, but they don't eliminate the other gods that are in their worldview. So that would be kind of an example of syncretization. And so there's some fear if we contextualize that we might compromise in some ways the gospel message. So, I mean, what do you guys use? What has been your approach to missions? Have you used these, whether or not you've used these titles or whether it's some mix? Um, I want to make one note too on church planting movements. We found that a hybrid between kind of contextualization and indigenization is the desired model. Where we see church planting movements really happening, really taking off, there is this idea of there is an outsider influence, but it's the insider who is really taking the lead, with the outsider playing more of a support role, whereas in the apostolic method, the outsider would be playing the lead role. In the indigenous method, the outsider would just be in a resourcing role, but completely separate. Where we're really seeing church planting movements happen is when outsiders can come in as support systems, aids, cultural outsider voices, but not leading the movements and in the efforts in and of themselves.
Yeah, so this is this is good in the sense that identifying and define these three things are very helpful, especially for anyone who has yet to go into the field. I think you mentioned, Jen, that people are not given the three choices and says you have to choose one. But I think it's very helpful because honestly, when in my training, although I knew about apostolic, and I'm gonna butcher it too, indigenization. They gotta come up with a different word. It's a tongue twister for me. I was not familiar with those terms. I'm more on the contextualization. Seems to be more prominent today in the conversations happening. And so I gotta say I do that more because I'm more mindful of it, right? If you're mindful of something, you tend to go ahead and do it. But I think all of us also have a desire that, hey, or even a joy to see the local person rise up and stand up and take charge. And even if you happen to stumble upon a church that was founded by a local, by a native, and it's fully functioning and it's doing well, sometimes you might even say, "What am I here for?" So I think all of us would desire that if we would see it. So I think I tend to go more on contextualization. But before I pass it to you, Jesse, to hear on what you do. I think there's a fourth one, whereas there should be called the prodigal son. People like me who I'm, for example, I'm ministering in Italy, and I grew up in Italy, but I went to live for the most of my life in America. I got the education there, got saved there, got trained there, was a pastor there, and then the Lord called me back. And I always reflect to the story of the demon possessed guy who got saved in Mark 5 and then wanted to follow Jesus. He just said, "You got to go to your own people." And so that's what the Lord sent me back to my own people. And so I kind of go into a different category. And I know there's a lot happening today because of the global connections that exist and just the very transient people. And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Well, you are the hybrid because you are both
Yeah.
the person trying to contextualize, but then you're also the indigenous person because you're native to the land. So you are the hybrid.
Yeah. I love that. And Alessandro, that's like actually there's a big movement with all of the what's happening with refugees and with
International students.
internationalization, people moving all around the globe. Missions is really a from everywhere to everywhere kind of concept right now. So what you're experiencing is so great, and it is replicatable. And there's even some talks about how can we capitalize on that, especially many of the people who do come to the States to do advanced studies and university and who find faith there. How can we equip them as they return to their places of origin to be doing missions? And I think that's um, in your case and in our generation right now, it's been a bit of an anomaly, but it's going to become, I think, more and more an actual approach we can pursue and define and talk about. And I think that's brilliant.
And if I can, just to chase that rabbit hole just a little bit farther, I think even with that being said, it's important to realize that the context in which someone is saved can disrupt the context in which what they're native to. So, for instance, I know of international students that go to America, and they might get saved there, and then their faith is very white evangelical North American faith, because that's where they were discipled, that's where they were plugged into it right away. And so then they would still need to do the work of thinking through contextualizing if they go back.
Amen.
So
amen. Well said.
Yeah, for me, this has been something I've been wrestling with quite a bit. We've been on the field for like 5 years and talking about church planting, and everybody's like, even Alessandro himself was like, what kind of church planting? What do you mean? What are you doing? And I feel like I want to avoid the apostolic method, so to speak, but I feel like in some ways I keep getting like sucked in a little bit to some degree, and I've seen a lot of value in the indigenous, and I've tried to platform and to help resource indigenous workers, and then but the prayer and the thing that I keep sharing with like our church planting team has been the idea of the hybrid. And so right now we have 2 American couples who would love to church plant with an Italian as well as part of that group, and for the Italian to be the pastor, and for us to resource and help that person. So that's like the dream, but it's hard to find someone. Like we've been struggling, and maybe we need to knock on different doors and look under different rocks. But it's just been something that has been really hard to put into action.
I agree, Jesse, and I think you underlined one of the harsh realities that can push us to choose maybe an approach that seems less than ideal. And with that, I think, gosh, first of all, there's a ton of grace. God works in all of these methods. God has worked in all of these methods. And sometimes we just have to say, God, how am I obedient to what you've asked me to do today in this place, and how you've made me and how you've gifted me? And I think there's a lot of grace in that. At the same time, I think we want to be really wise and discerning and think, is it just that I'm trying to move at a pace that the Spirit isn't moving at? And is there a call for patience and a call for just, continuing to do the work of evangelism and discipleship and sowing? And sowing can sometimes take longer before we see the fruit that we need, that's going to be reproducing and that's going to be sustaining in terms of leading and pastoring a church. And those are hard realities that I think we're called to wrestle with. And I think that just brings us back to the importance of personal devotion and spiritual habits and all of those things, because at the end of the day, I've got to trust the leading of the Lord and the Spirit of the Lord in me to do what he's put before me, even if I say, but Lord, that's not my approach. That's not that's not the method I was choosing. We just have to do what God's asking us to do, and be discerning in those places. And I think he doesn't give us a clear roadmap, because his desire is for us to walk closely with him, in intimacy with him each day, discerning our steps with him. So he could just say, Jesse, here's the plan. Monday, do this. In 3 weeks, do that. And in 2 years, do this, and then hand that up. But that's not how he's going to work.
Well, and I think too, as we were talking through this, I'm thinking there might be different seasons where different elements are being at play. So when you're at the beginning, when you're starting, maybe it does look a little bit more apostolic. And over time, you learn to contextualize. You learn to fit into the culture as you learn more about the culture.
So good.
And then as that happens, you start to see, oh, there's someone else who's native to this land doing this, and what if we came alongside and we worked together? So I don't know. It's always easier to have categories when we're thinking in theory, but then it quickly gets
Right.
messy when we start to put things into practice. Jen, what, for
Exactly.
you, what would be considered maybe a right way, or what in your studying and in preparation for this, what what would you say is the method or the route you prefer?
Well, this is where I came up with what I called, in the title of my dissertation is missions with. Um, and for me, that's where cross-cultural workers see themselves as ministering alongside and with the locals from the very onset. Um, so yeah, maybe I have some education or training or experience with the faith or with other things that I can mentor a local person on, and that can include discipling them, introducing them to Christ, evangelism. But even those who don't know Christ from the beginning, I'm dependent on them mentoring me too, and how things work in this culture, and in how love is given and received in this culture, and how people understand, different spiritual aspects, and what spirits are at work in this area, and what are people believing, and all of those sorts of things. So I think oftentimes we have this hierarchy of importance. So because I'm coming with the gospel and that's the most important thing, then I'm the A1 leader in this space. Rather than coming in humility that says, I have this really great news that I want to share, but I'm going to need help from the get go, sharing it. And I'm going to seek out that help and come in knowing that I need to do missions with. And yes, we'd like to say with believers from the beginning, but if we're in places where there aren't believers, I still need the help of the locals. And I think coming in with that attitude of, will you help me, helps people open up to where they might need help or input in their own lives as well. So I like the concept of mentoring over, leading. How can I mentor? And serving? How can I serve with the gospel in this culture? And then how can I be mentored and be served in this culture? And that to me would be approach of missions with. And then I'm not so worried about who's leading as much as how are we together, um, finding and discovering God's kingdom in this place.
Yeah, if I can make a comment about the three, just kind of thinking about when I first was about to come to Italy, I clearly remember a couple telling us you don't want to parachute in a place, you want to be next to other missionaries to have a support. So if just kind of thinking about Jenna, as you were talking about strengths and weaknesses, more from a approach perspective, I would say the apostolic approach is very lonely because there's this idea that you're going there, and even if you do find a local community that you're ministering to, you're still in the top. And so you don't have, of course, you have your supporters back home, but I could just see that being very lonely. And then the Indigenization, uh, that one, I could see that you require a lot of trust, right? You have to trust that they're going to use your resources, mostly financial resources, but there's a huge trust to trust that another culture is willing to take what you think is right forward. And then the middle one, and I could tell this in experience, is hard work. Contextualizing is hard work. It's sometimes annoying because you're like, oh yeah, I forgot that I'm thinking differently, and how is this gonna play out? Funny examples in our experiences, timing. I'm not even talking about timing and being on time. More like about Italians tend to do things very late. And so we tend to do things a little bit on the earlier side so then we can end the night earlier. And so really realizing we need to start doing things at a later time just because or else nobody will come. I would rather be home by that time, but that's when people are out and I need to be with the people. So that's just a funny example. But contextualization, so just going back, lonely for the apostolic, and then the Indigenization, I'm never going to get that right, is requires a lot of trust, and then that one requires a lot of work, contextualization.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you 100%. And it also means that we might take longer. It might take longer to get there. And that's the other thing. Like Apostolic has this idea that you're going to be in and out in 1 year or 3 years or whatever. And I've found that a lot of places, besides what you're talking about, yeah, Latin Europe tends to have later nights and all of that. But even just people don't move at the same pace. The rhythm of life and the rhythm of change, it is different in different places. And I don't know how long God will call me to a place till I get there and start getting into it.
Yeah, that's true. I think, yeah, I think the hybrid idea is really important because the yeah the to do missions with means not to you don't discredit yourself too. You see yourself as valuable, and you see who's already there and where God's already working as valuable. And so yeah, the idea of I'm coming to and I should contextualize. I should see how I can present this. But I think that's even I know that there's critics and there's people that have a hard time with that, but we do that in everything. When you're speaking with a 5-year-old, you adjust the way you speak in a way that they can understand it better. Um, and that's
Yeah.
I'm not trying to patronize different cultures, but you communicate in a way. I find myself when I speak with friends from I use different sayings and stuff. We might still be speaking in English, but I use sayings, I use ways of speaking in a cadence that is going to be easier for them to understand, because
Exactly.
communicating the message is what's most important. Making sure that the
Yep.
message gets from point A to point B is what's most important. So I think I think it's super important that we do it with him, and I think, yeah, maybe that's part of my frustration is that I want things to happen at a different time, but it will take, a longer time and take a while. And that's okay. And other people might not realize that that's okay. And I have to be okay with it and keep reminding other people like, yeah, we're doing this at the pace we believe God has us doing it. And we'll see what happens.
Yeah, there's an urgency with the gospel message, and I think that can burn inside of us while at the same time we move at the rhythm of the Spirit and at the pace that the people around us can metabolize the deep, profound truths of the gospel, which you just don't swallow overnight.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to for those listening in, when you contextualize, it does take longer, but it's not like we're doing 5 years of contextualization and now we start. We're doing it from the beginning, and so like people are,
Right,
God willing. I mean, at least in my context, I've seen people come to Christ even when I don't, when I messed it all
right,
up. When I'm like, oh
exactly.
yeah, but God was gracious and worked through that. Although we have to do our part and we have to keep working and get better and be more effective. Uh, God's still moving. God's
Yep,
holding our hand and opening doors and allowing us to experience His work, even when we're still trying to learn. And so that's something I did want to comment with the weakness of the contextualization where you mentioned, Jen, the syncretism. Just I think for me, from my experience, yes, that can happen, right? If you're being loose, you're not really thinking about what it means to uh, contextualize. But I think a real danger is when you don't understand the culture you're contextualizing. Because if you don't fully get something, kind of, you mentioned the idea or the example of Hinduism. If you just didn't know that in the and I'm speaking just from what you said and a little bit of what I know. I'm not an expert in Hinduism, but if you didn't know that Hindus can have multiple gods, including Jesus, you would not realize that, oh, I didn't realize you accepted Jesus and still keep the other gods. So then you would be like, he accepted Jesus, he just he or she just loves the cultural aspects, but they're saved. And you're like, oh, maybe I should have done some homework about that. And so I think that's the real dangers, when you really aren't aware of what you're dealing with.
yeah,
Well, and sometimes I think I think some people do it intentionally. Like they the Catholic Church has done that, and with animistic cultures that they've gone into, where they include different parts of the animism into saints and say, oh, well, we just call that this saint. Well, it's actually a whole different thing, but they've syncretized.
Yeah.
Wow. So any other concluding thoughts, Jen? Is this something that I have a bonus question, I guess, to ask? Is this something that missionaries should be wrestling with before they ever leave to go serve wherever they're going? Or is this something you think kind of gets fleshed out when you're on the ground and working?
I mean, I think it's a both and. I think we should sometimes just awareness of some of these differences will help us to shape our mission and our thinking. And again, it's not that you have to choose a bucket and stay in it. I think it's just good to recognize that, okay, historically people have done it this way and people have done it that way. And here's some strengths of one and here's some weaknesses of another. And then it goes back to, yeah. And that can be done before you're on the field in some level of cognitive understanding. But as we've all pointed out, when you get on the field, you have to just wake up each day and figure out, what is the contribution that God's asking me to make today in this place through who I am and through where he's already at work. And so it's I would say both and. Like if you come with a plan, and we've probably all done this to some extent because you can't help it as you're dreaming and starting to launch and working with other people, you do start to sort of formulate a plan. Well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to show up here and I'm going to do this on day one and I'm going to do this. And then you realize about 3 minutes into it that your plan is not going to work. It's just not going to work. So, it doesn't mean you don't make a plan.
Yeah.
Those help us understand ourselves and understand what's possible and understand some history and understand. But it also doesn't mean that you can set your plan and set it and forget it kind of a
thing. They help to get us moving, and then we have to adjust. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just say that in contextualization, I know you mentioned Hudson Taylor, and what he did was actually cut his hair or style his hair like the Chinese, as well as his clothing. I gotta say that is the hardest thing for me, is to mimic or be like the Italian. I just can't. I'm like this in this aspect. I'm American.
You can't keep up with the fashion.
I can't. They're too fashionable.
I mean, I think we are strangers, and there's a point. But it was funny. I was at a mission leaders conference here in France where we had a French leader come in and talk to us, and he was almost disparaging of the fact that many Americans, you can tell them by their shoes, like they all still buy their shoes in the U.S. And he just thought that was like somehow a diss on the French, like my American shoes are better. And it really got me thinking. I mean, I love French clothes and I love French shoes and all of that, but the reality is, French people are just a little bit more petite than I am, and I'm not fat. I'm just talking the way their bodies are built. The pants made for French women just don't fit me. I have to buy my pants in Germany. So sometimes I think there's limitations that locals don't even realize. Like, and then that made me realize, well, maybe some people buy their shoes in the States because their feet just don't fit into French shoes. So yeah, we do what we can, and then other stuff you just gotta let it go.
That's good. Well, today we've talked about different approaches to missions: apostolic, contextualization, indigenization, and finally the missions with that idea of the hybrid. How we go about missions will communicate a message, and the most important thing is to make sure that our approach is consistent with the gospel message that we are preaching. So thank you guys for listening to this episode. We pray that this would be beneficial and a resource to your ministries. And please do all of the things that you can. Just like, subscribe, leave us a comment. If you're on the Spotify app, it's really cool. You can actually go on there and just audio record a question or a thought that you want to share with us. So that would be really fun to receive. But thank you so much for listening to Going.